The Russian Revolution was started by a bunch of starving workers protesting under Tsar Nicholas II. The trouble with this is, it just isn't so. This was a comment. It was found in the comment sections left by a username of Blooper. Shout out to Blooper. Fascinating historical event. And we're just not given all the information. A bunch of starving students or starving workers? What? Trying to unpack all this in a 20-minute video is like trying to bail out the sinking Titanic with a teaspoon, but I'm going to give it my best shot. I did take some notes. I will be referring to them. A lot of information. I'm not even capable of the... But let's go back. The interesting part in this, you have to follow the money. Where does money come from to fund revolutions? In 1879, John D. Rockefeller controlled about 97% of petroleum production and refinery capacity in America. He'd cornered the market, but it wasn't enough. He wanted all of it internationally. Wasn't it John D. Rockefeller that told us competition is a sin? Also in the late 1800s, there was the opening of the great Russian oil fields, the Baku field near the Caspian Sea. And Tsar Nicholas II invited the Nobel brothers and the Rothschild banking interest to help develop these oil fields. Seems like Standard Oil now had competition. Competition is a sin. In 1885, the USA, Standard Oil mostly, produced 3.1 million tons of petroleum. Russia, by this time, had produced, 2 million tons. Creeping up there. In 1895, Vladimir Lenin and 9 others, including Leon Trotsky, formed the Socialist Democratic Labor Party, the forerunner to the Communist Party. By 1901, the U.S. oil production was at 9.9 million tons, but Russia had produced 12.17 million tons of petroleum. Fast forward to the spring of 1905, the British Fabian Society, non-violent revolutionary group, met the Bolsheviks in London, England. Loans were arranged to start a revolution. Joseph Fels, a wealthy American soap manufacturer, loaned large sums of money. Fels Naphtha. That's a great product, by the way. It's now owned by Dial. I make my homemade laundry booster out of it. But anyway, the initial revolutionary efforts were unsuccessful in the early 1900s in Russia. The Tsar exiled Lenin to Switzerland, Trotsky was sent to the United States, and Joseph Stalin was sent to Siberia. If we fast forward to 1917, on March 27th, Leon Trotsky left New York City with 275 followers on his way to Canada. He was detained in Halifax, Nova Scotia by the Canadian government. On his person was found $10,000 in cash. That's $230,000 in today's money. 10 grand. He was detained. The Canadian government contacted the United States government. Just it's nothing. Don't worry about it. Let him go. It's fine. Even though Trotsky said the previous 2 years his combined earnings were about $300, and he had distributed this between 5 of his buddies to help him out, workers, it's nothing. Don't worry about it. I'm admittedly skipping over a lot of stuff. You had a bunch of transitional governments. You had the Duma. There's a lot of stuff you can look into on your own. There was a big push for power. Now, involved in this too, you had World War I, and they were taking skilled laborers in the cities and driving them off to war, and they were bringing in what they referred to as peasants, farmers basically, to try to fill these skilled labor positions. The farms, however, weren't suffering initially. The crops were being produced, but it was the hyperinflation of the ruble which drove up foodstuffs costs approximately 4 times what they had been, and labor was stagnant, so people suddenly couldn't afford to buy food. So yes, you did have hungry workers. And if you want to piss people off and get them to protest, cut off their food. It's, it's a tried and tested method. On November 25th, 1917, there was to be an election. And there was a lot of argument over should we even allow this election to go forward. And it was Trotsky who said, yeah, we should do this. The ideas are sound. We're for the workers. Well, what did they have? 42 million votes cast. The Bolsheviks, which is a Russian term meaning the majority. Well, they weren't the majority. But they had a propaganda machine. They had control of the newspapers. We can win the election. Well, out of the 42 million votes that were cast, the Bolsheviks received about 30%. So when given a chance for the Russian people to vote on whether they wanted communism or not, 70% of them said no, of those that voted. They won 30% of the election. Just don't pay any attention to that. By 1919, the Japanese wanted to get involved and put down the Bolshevik. They saw what was coming, and United States President Woodrow Wilson refused to allow them to get involved. Director of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, William B. Thompson, he gave a personal loan of $1 million to help fund the Bolsheviks. J.P. Morgan, Rockefeller, they contributed cash. Jacob Schiff gave Lenin $20 million. German banking interests gave 40 million gold marks, approximately $5 million US. They couldn't do it on their own. You have to follow the money. Now, if we zoom forward to about 1930, the communists, the Bolsheviks, have been in power now, 12, 13 years? 12 more. There was a 1930s dictate under Joseph Stalin. He's now in power. And he's basically saying we're an agrarian country, and if we don't tool up and we don't war up, we're going to get run over. The trouble with that is, communist bureaucrats don't know how to build or run factories. Students were put in power. Students and white-collar workers were given, the argument was always, initially, we're going to give people control of their land. It's not owned by the Tsar. The Tsar, he thought he was king by divine right. His family had been in power for 300 years. He was a woefully inept character. And mind you, he's going on vacation. He's got the hunting dogs. He's got money is not an issue. He didn't know or care if the people were starving. At one point during the revolts, he dedicated himself to being in charge of the military. He was woefully inept at that. And his wife, he put as far to run, the Russian economy and the domestic side of things. Well, she was of German descent. They were being attacked by there was a war. And so people right off the hop was like, well, she is German, and it's the German people. This ain't gonna work. What are you doing? Yeah, they were pissed off. They had every right to be pissed off. And people were hungry. People were leaving. This has been a subsistence operation. You grew enough to feed yourself and feed your livestock. And now people were coming into the cities. Stop me at any time and remind me if any of this sounds kind of like what's going on present day. I don't know, maybe. So bureaucrats, turns out, don't know how to build or run factories. Well, enter a man named Albert Kahn, a man of German descent. He's living in America. He's considered the architect of Detroit. Look that fella up. Built a lot of buildings. And he learned how to work with concrete, and he learned how to tool up plants and build massive production factories. He designed Henry Ford's famous war factory, Willow Run, which turned out bombers, airplanes. He designed the, what was it called? The River Rouge plant for Ford. By 1930, he gets a contract from the Soviets to build 521 Soviet plants and factories. Hundreds of tons of American machines and tools were shipped to Soviet factories. They trained the Soviets in architecture. They trained them how to build these factories. And when that didn't work initially, they just built it for them. The Stalingrad tractor factory was actually built in America, disassembled, and shipped to the Soviet Union and reassembled. Now we get to the early part of World War II. Germany breaks its agreement with Russia. They were going to initially divide Poland, half for the Soviet Union and half for Germany. Well, Germany breaks this agreement and invades Russia, and I mean they came with a vengeance. And Russia is cranking out everything they can do. Now, this is the mentality here, some of it. Russia was cranking out tanks, big time. I can't give you the number. I had it. I've got a lot of numbers, and we'll get to the numbers in a minute, some more. But Russia's cranking out tanks so fast, it boggles the mind. And they're bragging. Look at the superiority of the Soviet machine in full force. And they're just cranking out tanks and munitions and weapons for the war. And it turns out they didn't even have the foresight to think about how are we going to get fuel to run these machines to the front. They have no trucks. They cranked out more tanks than they did automobiles for the populace here by 1941, 42. They had no way to get them fuel, get them food. The Soviet troops were starving. They were barefoot. At one point, initially, with the onslaught of the Germans against the Russians, it was so vast, Russia decided, the Soviet Union decided, we need to move these plants. And in a massive display of manpower, they disassembled these plants and moved them 700 miles further back from the front lines to keep them being seized. If they'd have been seized by the Germans, that would have been it. The Soviets would have been crushed. Well, it was this woefully inefficient deal because that's what communism is. The state is running things now. They did get them moved, and there was no infrastructure, there was no buildings already existent. Some of the munitions were lost, some of the parts of the factories were shipped too far. It was an absolute mess, but they did pull it off. Unfortunately, still no way to get fuel. I mean, they're cranking out tanks that came off the assembly line and went into the conflict immediately. Now, another problem we have with communism is there is no personal incentive. It isn't like the U.S. In the U.S., the companies had to fight each other and establish contracts, and the best products won. In the Soviet Union, the state owns everything. So they were dishing out a lot of crap off the assembly lines. Well, then the Soviets came up with the bonus program, and they did this with almost all of their things. You know, we need food. We need munitions for the war, and there's going to be bonuses. So just to keep numbers simple, we want 100 tanks. And if you do more than that, there's a bonus. Well, the guys in charge initially fell for that. And so let's say you cranked out 120 in that year. Guess what the quota was set at for the next year? 123. You can do it. You've proven you can do it. Or the flip side of that was they were way under. Let's say if the quota was 100 tanks, you made 79 on purpose, trying to show that the quota was set at too high. It's a woefully inefficient system, and it's never worked anywhere. Now, still in the World War II era here, timeline, 1940s, early. Under, again, FDR, under the Lend-Lease program, he's going to supply the Soviets. And he did. 35,000 motorcycles, 10,000 railway flat cars, 2,000 steam locomotives, 400,000 jeeps and trucks. So they could finally bring things like fuel and food to their frontline soldiers. Some of these soldiers, they didn't care, man. They were sent out without boots. They were sent out without a weapon even. And they were sent out by twos. And if your partner gets killed and he drops his weapon, pick it up. Now you have one. Or pick one up off of a dead German soldier. They couldn't fight. They couldn't withstand on their own. It has never worked anywhere. All the stuff was delivered by U.S. quote-unquote liberty ships, just given to the Russian people. Over the course of the war, 2.6 million tons of oil, mostly aviation fuel, was given to the Russians. $127 billion was given to the Russians by the Americans over the course of the war. Quinine, bullets, bombs, and of course the food, because you gotta feed them. This next part I'm gonna read to you. Herbert Hoover saved Lenin's dictatorship from popular revolt in the early 1920s, and there's further proof that Hoover, then President Harding's Secretary of Commerce, knew U.S. shipments for food which the American people were told to save starving Russians actually were used to strengthen Bolshevik power. In his book, Herbert Hoover and Famine Relief to Soviet Russia, Professor Benjamin Weissman of Rutgers University revealed that Hoover continued to send public foodstuffs to Russia long after it was obvious the Bolsheviks were shipping their own food abroad in order to purchase machinery. So what did this great socialist order get us? Well, here's some of the things that happened. Private ownership of land was abolished. Banks were nationalized. Most industrial enterprises were nationalized. The merchant marine was nationalized. The stock market was slowly abolished. The right of inheritance was abolished. Gold was declared a state monopoly. All government debts were declared null and void. We just don't owe you anything anymore. The old criminal courts were replaced by revolutionary tribunals in which any citizen could act as a judge or lawyer. Old strict marriage and divorce laws were replaced by very lenient civil codes. The church was not abolished, but its lands were seized and religious teaching was forbidden in the schools. The state is your God now. Any of those things sound like a good idea? And as a side note here, and I'm not saying, I'm just saying, women's rights were massively increased during this time. They were finally allowed to read, which was formerly forbidden under the Tsar. Homosexuality and the illegality of it was abolished. Just saying. I'm going to read this next part to you too, because what was it that the Americans were supporting? Well, Lenin answered that question in writing. Quote, "Our power does not know liberty or justice. It is entirely established on the destruction of individual will. We are the masters. Complete indifference to suffering is our duty. In the fulfillment of our calling, the greatest cruelty is a merit." He went on to write, "Through a systematic terror during which every breach of contract, every treason, every lie will be lawful, we will find the way to abase humanity down to the lowest level of existence. That is indispensable to the establishment of our dominance." What they claim, end quote, by the way. And a great book on this that covers way more than this. I mean, this book will knock your socks off. It's called The Unseen Hand, written by A. Ralph Epperson. I've had a conversation or two with him over the phone. He's an interesting man. It was supported and funded primarily by American business interests. Those are the facts. I'm sorry if they bother you. It is interesting to note that Adolf Hitler is known as when people mention evil, Who's the most evil man that ever lived? Well, Adolf Hitler. And it's estimated between 6 and, I've heard, 12, 14 million deaths attributed to Hitler. But between Lenin and Joseph Stalin, you're talking upwards of 100 million people that were either killed or starved to death. And I'm skipping totally, there's a gnat in here. I'm skipping totally what happened in Ukraine with Holodomor, where they stacked up bodies like cordwood from people starving to death. And an excellent book on that is called Red Famine. Anne Applebaum is the author of that one, Stalin's War on Ukraine. And man, this is a tough book to get through because of the cruelty and the suffering. This is what we're supporting. It's being taught now in your universities. You better be careful what you wish for. You people have no idea what you're supporting. What the West has always supported. It couldn't function on its own. Communism couldn't. And hasn't. It has failed everywhere it's been. But there's still this push. There's still this agenda by the academia. The very system that it claimed to absolve and rend asunder, once their power was checked, that it was total, we're in power now, just kill them. Dude, look into some of these names. I can't unpack this all in 20 minutes. The Decembrist movement. I mean, and the extrapolations of communism. What happened with Cuba? Go look how those people are living now. They're driving cars, abandoned vehicles from America in the 1950s. They fix them and put them back on the road. It's all they have because the system doesn't work. But yeah, it was a bunch of hungry people, and they rose up, and that they wanted, a better deal. So they wanted communism. Yeah, that's what it was. I appreciate your time. I appreciate your watching. Look into some of this stuff, man. It's we're seeing it now in this country because people don't know their history. I appreciate your time. Thanks for watching. I'd appreciate it if you like, subscribe, share, all that stuff with the thing and the deal. See you next time.